Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. Hi, Tracy. My name is Ian Kenny, and I'm the Program and Development Coordinator here at the John Adams Institute. And on behalf of our entire team, welcome to you, our audience, to our loyal sponsors, to our guest of honor, Tommy Orange, and also, of course, to our moderator for the evening, Jessie Morgan Owens. I'm thrilled that we can be together tonight for an evening of literature. As some of you may know, the John Adams Institute actually got its start way back when, primarily as a podium for American literature in the Netherlands. And I'm really pleased that we can continue in that great tradition altogether by welcoming Tommy Orange back into our community tonight. Tommy joined us here in Amsterdam back in 2019 after taking the American literary scene by storm with his first book, There. And we're grateful to host him again in Amsterdam for the Dutch translation of his second and highly anticipated novel, Wandering Stars, which translates into Dutch as Dwalende Sterren. The book is for sale tonight, thanks to our longtime partners at Atheneum Boekhandel, but of course special thanks are due to the wonderful team at Meulenhof for translating and publishing the book and working with us to bring Tommy here to the Netherlands. Thanks to their efforts, we can all come together on nights like these to listen to stories that make us richer, fuller people. As a vehicle for investigation into the state of the United States and certainly topics of global importance, literature is maybe one of the greatest and perhaps the most illuminating tools that we have. There's nothing like walking a mile in someone's shoes or dipping inside of a character's brain to help shift something inside of yourself and maybe change your perspective. So I'd also like to thank our friend Sarah Carragher, the director of the International Writers Collective Amsterdam, for hosting Tommy at the Writers Loft, as well as the University of Leiden for collaborating with us on this event. And there are many students and writers here in the audience with us tonight, both established and aspiring, and I know that they're really excited to join us, and we are glad that you can be here in Amsterdam too. As my grandmother always said when organizing big family events, the more the merrier, right? Soon I'll hand the podium over to Jessie Morgan Owens, who will introduce us to the world of Wandering Stars, before Tommy himself tells us more about the novel and how it came to be. And after Tommy's keynote talk, Jessie will join him back on stage for a conversation, and you will have the opportunity throughout, when Jessie gives you the okay, to ask questions. So please feel free to keep them top of mind as they come up. At the end of the interview, John Adams director Tracy Metz will, of course, close the evening and tell you more about our upcoming programs and all the other wonderful things going on at the John Adams Institute that we very much hope you would like to be a part of. Before we get to all that, I just want to share a few brief meditations with you. For those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity to read it, Wandering Stars is a powerful but challenging narrative. It's not that the book is difficult to read, quite the opposite. Tommy's use of language is masterful, and the sentences vibrate with beauty, but also with sadness, sometimes anger, and even in the book's darkest moments, they glimmer with hope. The characters are deeply human. Their struggles and triumphs are little windows into the soul. All in all, it's a very powerful read that helps us reinterpret American literature, and I would argue American history, in the light of the present. Following the Starr family from the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre right up to present-day Oakland, California, Tommy has woven a narrative that makes big historical moments personal. The novel draws you in. It asks you to be a part of it, a part of its story through thick and thin, and for better and worse. So to my mind, this book is then maybe also about what we pass on to each other. What we personally choose to remember, and maybe what we collectively opt to forget. As always, the author says it best himself. In the novel, one of Tommy's many protagonists writes, "I don't think stories were made to comfort. I believe what my father told me, Stories do more than comfort. They take you away and they bring you back better made. So to help us delve into that, we've invited Jessie Morgan Owens to moderate the evening. Jessie is the Program Chair of North American Studies at Leiden University and the University Lecturer for American Literature, a subject that she has been teaching in a variety of forms, courses, and institutions for 20 years. We've got a true expert amongst our midst. Originally from Louisiana, Jessie moved to the Netherlands for her current position in 2021 and was previously Dean of Studies at Bard Early College in New Orleans. Jessie is the author of many academic publications, as well as the book Girl in Black and White, the story of Mary Mildred Williams and the abolition movement. Her work focuses on how literature and other cultural artifacts can change our lives and give us insight into the world around us. And aside from her many accomplishments, I also have it on good authority and saw yesterday for myself that Jessie is a highly regarded figure on campus by both students and staff alike, known for bringing community together to discuss important topics that don't always get their time in the sun. And we're very glad that she's making her John Adams debut with us this evening in conversation with Tommy Orange. So please give her a warm John Adams welcome, and Jessie, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Hello, and everybody. How are you? Yeah? Very good. Can I have a show of hands of how many people in the room knew about the Sand Creek Massacre before reading this book? How many people, leave them up, if you knew about the Colorado Wars? Okay, not bad, not bad. All right. What about the Carlisle Institute? Okay. That's helpful, thank you. So there's this wonderful quip from Ford Madox Ford that you can tell the quality of any novel by looking at page 99. So I think we should try that now, yeah? Let's do that, okay. On page 99 of this novel, we have one of my favorite narrators, and it is narrated in the second person. This is the chapter that features Vicky. And it says, "It's time you come to find out who you come from, someone you should know about before you become who you become, will be how your father starts the story, confused seeming, and trailing off at the end of a sentence, he won't finish, slurring his words, but determined to say what he is about to say. Your mother was an Indian. Your birth mother's name was Opal Viola Bear Shield. We still have a box of her stuff around here somewhere, stuff she had before he will say, getting up, but then plopping back down when his eyes indicate the room has turned on him." All right, I'll stop there. I actually read into page 100 if you're tracking. I see the author is like, wait a second, that's not page 99. So I think this is really interesting. It's actually a good entry into the book because it gives us entrance into one of the tropes that passes through the novel, which is this archive that Charles Starr, one of the 19th century characters, has written and passed down. And we know as readers that it exists, but these characters don't know it exists, many of them. And in this case, it's particularly stark because she doesn't even know her lineage until her father in a drunken moment tells her about it, right? With this archive. So I think it's an important thing to turn to the next time this archive walks out. And that's on page 247, which is easily my favorite 2 pages in the book, but that's just personal to me. And yes, it would be nice, but the past goes back in dimensions unknown too. I was reading about the lives of the people who got me here, who made me who I am. That was what was in the box that Maxine gave me, that my mother left for us, a story. And yes, it would be nice if the rest of the country understood that not all of us have our culture or language intact directly because of what happened to our people, how we were systematically wiped out from the outside in and then the inside out, and consistently dehumanized and misrepresented in the media and in educational institutions. But we needed to understand it for ourselves, the extent we made it through, the extent. I wanted to read you that second passage. In part, there's so much that I cut too that's really wonderful, so I'm not going to read you my whole 2 favorite pages. But I wanted to read you that passage because it helps you to understand how tied to history this book is, right? But those of you who read there, wait, show of hands, how many people have also read there? Wow, Tommy, you're seeing this? The entire room has read there. And in there, as well as in this book, there's a prologue that is historical, right? It's a historical prologue. It begins in a we that is an overarching vision of history. But there's another moment in the text where we hear that human history is an elaborate hoax. And we also hear this spot that the archive that Maxine has held for the family is holding the history that has been erased. And only a smattering of hands knew about Sand Creek, right? And even fewer knew about the Colorado Wars. And so there's so much of our history that's missing, right? By our, I mean everyone's, not just American. Although American history is particularly good at this job, right? And I want to think about for a moment what it means for a writer of Tommy Orange's status, because he's real big news in the US, y'all. And an artist of his status to step back into that history and try to make it connect to our present is a true gift, right? Because what we need, I think, in our conversations right now in the world are moments where the past and the present fold together, right? Because we need moments where the past is present and that it also permits a future. And so I have so many questions for tonight, and I can't wait to get started. But one of the big ones that I have is, what do we do with this history once we have it on our hearts, right? Once we know that 675 armed men destroyed a village in Colorado, 2/3 of which were women and children. The numbers are in the hundreds, but sometimes reported as less than 100, but we know that it was a total destruction, right? And it wasn't the only time, it wasn't even the first time. And so when we think about all of those different moments of massacre that are unwritten or undiscussed, then it's even more important for us to take the time to read novels like this. Because I don't know about y'all, but the reason I first picked up this novel wasn't because of the history stuff. I just wanted to know what happened to Opal. I wanted to know what happened to Orville. I was in love with these characters and I needed to know, right? And so we are grateful for a sequel to exist so that we can live with these characters again. But again, there's a little bit of a gift here that I want you to spend time with when you read, is to think about how these characters are processing their pasts. How are they handling the intergenerational weight of this past? Once they have the archive, how do they make sense of it, right? I gotta read you just one more thing, and then I'm gonna let Tommy do the reading. This part was a big hit with my students when we did a seminar on this a few weeks ago. Orville used to say, "We're more like time travelers than anything else," Lonnie said on page 220. "Who's we, you three?" "Native people." "How so?" "Everyone only thinks we're from the past. But then we're here, but they don't know we're still here, so then it's like we're in the future. Like time travelers would feel." Or, I don't know, Orville said it better. I think I know what you mean. I've heard white people talking about being the descendants of people who came on the Mayflower, like that gives them some more right to the country. But nobody expects them to be wearing buckles on their shoes or on their hats. Why do they wear the buckles on their hats? To tighten them. There. So I'm really interested to hear more about futurity and about the past and how the two sit with us together in this novel, but also to hear about what it was like for Tommy to write a book that has a different beginning. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to this conversation.
Okay, wait. I have a thing on, and I'm also speaking to this.
I think we can move this thing.
That thing kind of sings anyway. It's got a sing to it.
The engineer told me to turn this thing on that's underneath the battery.
Okay.
Situation.
It might sing, right? Yeah.
This will if the boat.
Yeah.
So we have to move that away. Sorry, I
Sounded to you.
It's still happening. It's because that was still live. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Ian, Jesse. Very generous and immense way to introduce me that makes me feel like I'm going to disappoint the audience at this point. So, yeah, I was here in Amsterdam in 2019, sort of against my will. I had this 2019 European tour I was doing on my own that was going to be Italy, Amsterdam, Sweden. And I openly told my wife, I don't want to go. I'd been traveling so much. We had done a huge 6-week European tour together, and this is all like the most annoying thing an author can tell you. Like, my success is, man, I don't like to travel across the world anymore. I don't mean to come off like that. I'm telling the story because I almost didn't come on the trip at all to Amsterdam for the first time, because in Oakland, my luggage and my passport all got stolen right before, on the way to the airport. And I called my agent and said, so I don't have to go now, right?
Yeah.
And my agent is very experienced and knows a lot about the whole sort of industry of publishing and why I need to keep good relations internationally. And she said, no, you're going still. So I got a temporary, or like a super fast temporary passport and came to Amsterdam and then Sweden. And the reason I'm telling you this story is not just because I came to Amsterdam, which was great. I loved it. I didn't really get to see this place. I had back-to-back interviews for 2 days in like an office room. So that's not seeing Amsterdam. I've seen a lot more since I've been here, and tomorrow I have a free day, and I'm here with my mother-in-law, who's right here with me, and we'll get to experience the actual place. So I'd been writing a sequel to There. It's the first book that I wrote, came out in 2018. And the reason I'm telling you this story is not just to like be relatable about Amsterdam. After Amsterdam, I went to Sweden, and my Swedish publisher hooked me up with a museum curator who asked me on a tour of a museum. And I feel generally ambiguous about museums. And he gave me this tour that was like very apologetic and meta, like, we know we're not supposed to have this stuff, and like, we're trying to figure out how to repatriate, and but we have some of your people's stuff upstairs. Do you want to see it? And I'm like, yeah. So we go up, and I see regalia from Southern Cheyenne people on the second floor. But above that, I see a newspaper clipping that says Southern Cheyenne people in Florida in 1875. And I fall down this historical rabbit hole that made this book be what it is, because I was writing a straightforward sequel, and it was just following in the aftermath of what happens at the end of There There. And I never wanted to write historical Native stuff, because that's normally the way we've been depicted. It's, I did a profile of our most famous Native actor. His name is Wes Studi. And he basically said, like, his bread and butter is leathers and feathers, because Hollywood continually wants him as an actor in a historical part, and historical, I hate that about English, that it has that, where he's this, historical Native guy. And Native people have been living in cities since the 1950s. And 80% of us have been living in cities for 20 years. And there's no stories indicating that in American media and representation. So, I didn't want to write a history piece, but this thing happened where I was in Sweden right after Amsterdam, and I found out about this part of history that was related to the origin of boarding schools, basically. And I had already decided that the name of the book would be Wandering Stars before There There even came out in 2018. And then when I started doing research, discovered that the prison castle where half of the prisoners of war, at the origin of boarding schools, through Richard Henry Pratt as their jailer, sort of where he had them, the prison castle was shaped like a star. And one of the prisoners there's name was Star, but another one of the prisoners there's name was Bear Shield, which is a family from my first book. And when I discovered that, I'm like, there's coincidence and there's, woo-woo stuff that goes in and out of a novel and in everybody's life experience. Like, I am spiritually damaged by parents who are on fire for God, and I'm like in a church, like afraid of saying things that are too anti-God. But it was a moment and a decision that I made, like, I'm gonna write this historical piece. And it happened in Sweden, and it happened as a part of this Amsterdam trip, and it was totally crazy. And the only crazier moment in writing novels that ever happened was in There There, and only certain people know this if they've heard it in interviews. There's a moment in There There where one of the characters pulls spider legs out of their own leg in a Target, West Oakland Target bathroom. And I'll share with you now, just in the spirit of spiritual weird stuff in the church. I pulled spider legs out of my own leg while I was writing There There. While I was writing, certain language about spiders, and it was a totally crazy thing. And my wife saw me coming out of the bathroom, and my face was like totally like I just saw a ghost. And I showed her the legs, and we proceeded to show all of our friends spider legs that had come out of my leg. And I called my dad after scouring the internet, like, what is this? The internet had nothing to give me. Aside from the urban myths of like exploding sort of nests of spider, I don't know what to call them, but like people with stories about like exploding nests of spiders, baby spiders coming out of different places. So there was nothing on the internet. And I called my dad and I was like, does this sound like anything that you... And he said, it sounds to me like you got witched. And I was like, okay, well, what do I do? And he said, I'll pray for you. And that's it. Had nothing else for me. And so I gave it to my fictional character because I had already written in spider stuff. And I didn't want it to have to do with my life because it didn't seem to fit, not even according to the internet, however far I searched. And it felt like it worked well for a fictional sort of literary device of some sort. But it was a real thing that happened. I pulled spider legs out of my own leg. And a lot of these things that have gone into both books have been pulled from real history, from my own life, and also just from wherever fiction comes from. They asked me to go a little bit longer on saying things out loud, telling stories, and also in reading, and I may have gone off course a little bit in going into the spider leg thing. I feel a little bit intimidated about being in a church, and like I'm wondering about like where do you order those kind of curtains? Like the length is insane. Like it's a custom made thing, right? That length is insane. There's no house, right? So there's like a church website. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from the sort of contemporary part of Wandering Stars. One of the characters is a survivor of a shooting, sort of a mass shooting event. That's all you need to know. A bad thing doesn't stop happening to you just because it stops happening to you. In therapy, this is called trauma. Opal had me doing therapy twice a week, individual and group, to make sure I had the help I needed if I needed it. That was how Opal put it to me, and that I had to go. Opal was over careful about not saying that I needed therapy. Of course I needed it. It was more like I had to go, like the way I always had to go to school and had to get good grades. Go get. Don't give anyone an excuse to leave you behind, not see you, to forget you're there. Opal averaged 10 miles a day on her mail route, so if anyone knew about not getting left behind, it was her. We would not let what happened be the reason I get behind in school, even though school hadn't even started yet. Opal said we would rise above what happened because bad things happening to you are opportunities, ways to find out who you were, find out what else couldn't keep you down, and were the only way you could find out how strong you really were. Opal got too positive after the powwow. It wasn't like her. She'd always been so real. Positive thinking sounds stupid, but I get it. I just hated that what happened had changed her, had changed everything. Hated it so much that some days I wished the bullet had killed me. So I needed therapy. Obviously, I needed therapy. I'd gotten shot while I was dancing. That was some fucked up shit to have happened. But there was more I should have been to therapy about before. My whole childhood with my mom and before she died. Nobody wants to be told they need therapy, just like nobody wants to be told they got problems. Paid therapy felt better to me than some kind of free or court-mandated kind. Plus, the therapist was supposedly native. Opal found him on the internet. He'd said his grandmother was a full-blooded Arapaho. He looked white to me. And then sometimes not. Sometimes he seemed hella Indian. Like in what he said and the way he said it, like how what Opal said could sometimes seem to come from a long time ago. And you just knew it was some hard-won wisdom passed down to her. Something simple and timeless that you could actually use in your life. I'd heard the word trauma before. Everyone knows the word trauma. But when I heard it used about me, I didn't like it. All the work we'll be doing together will be related to your trauma response, Dr. Hoffman had said in our first session. The 4 F's, he said. There are 4 kinds of trauma responses, 2 of which you've probably heard of. Everyone's heard of this, fight and flight. But the 2 other lesser-known responses are freeze and fawn. Fawn? Isn't that like a deer? I said, and a yawn escaped Dr. Hoffman's mouth, which he visibly tried to suppress by putting his fist to his nose and sort of squeezing his face. After which he didn't fully yawn, but did that yawn version of throwing up in your mouth. It has to do with taking care of other people's feelings and putting their feelings before your own. We will address all forms of trauma response in our healing work. I didn't think healing and work belonged together like home and work didn't. And it felt like homework thinking about doing healing work. But the healing work just ended up being art therapy, like drawing and painting and drumming and writing. Learning to reframe my story with writing. Dr. Hoffman wanted me to write what he was calling an autobiography, which I told him I didn't want to write. So we did physical stuff meant to express or exercise my pain and emotions. Once we did a walking meditation around Lake Merritt that felt like it took forever. Another time we went up to the hills and shot an arrow with a bow at some paper targets taped to a redwood. Calling it archery in the end wasn't enough to make it feel okay to be native and shooting a bow and arrow in the woods for therapy. But I had to admit it was kind of fun, and I wanted to be good at shooting the bow and arrow, as if it were some test I needed to pass, as if I should just know how, like that knowledge should be in my DNA. The craziest thing we did was called reverse speech therapy. Dr. Hoffman recorded me saying stuff in our sessions, then processed it with something he called backmasking, which was just playing it in reverse from what I could tell. Dr. Hoffman said that the backmasked version was my unconscious speaking reverse simultaneously as I consciously said things forward. You're saying, what are you saying? I asked. And Dr. Hoffman laughed, then coughed a cough that seemed caused by the laughter. You're saying whatever I say, some other part of me is saying another thing, but it can only be heard if I listen to it backward. Your unconscious is a powerful, powerful part of you, Dr. Hoffman said. I didn't like how he'd said powerful twice in a row like that, but also felt like Dr. Hoffman's unconscious was what was behind him saying it twice in a row like that. All humans have this ability. Dr. Hoffman cleared his throat and pointed at his throat, saying, double speaking is natural for our vocal cords and true to the dual nature of reality. Think of all the ways the world is split in two, night and day, sleeping and waking, life and death, good and evil, noise and silence, darkness and light. As he spoke and repeated these opposites to illustrate his point, he kept flipping his palm so it faced up and then down. The unconscious way of speaking is closer to poetry, and the conscious one is closer to prose. Yeah, but it's like saying everybody has some split personality. If we don't acknowledge the unconscious, which is what it wants, then we allow it to run the show, as in dreams or worse, nightmares. And we never wake up to who we are as a whole. Are you talking about being woke? I said. I'm trying to be funny. I'm talking about seeing the mind as being more than what we think we know it to be. One recorded clip had me saying, I really don't think I'm doing that bad. And then backward or back masked, the recording had me saying, gonna nod, might nod, delirious. I didn't think it meant anything then, but later, way later, something I couldn't even see the start of then, when I was actually nodding out from too many pills, that phrase ended up messing with me. Like, did some part of me somehow know what was coming? Group therapy was just talking circles with other kids who I thought probably had to be there, like they were court mandated. In group sessions, Dr. Hoffman would always do most of the talking before anyone else to explain why the talking mattered in talking circles. Like everyone could just kumbaya their way back from trauma. It's important to voice things, to sound them out, like the way we learn to spell by slowly saying words. We have to sound out our stories, and they may come out slow and clumsy, and we may misspell them, so to speak, at first when we first go to try, which is to say we may misunderstand them. But as we frame and reframe them, our own stories, the ones we tell each other and tell ourselves about what happened to us and what it means in the context of our lives and the bigger life we're a part of, the better we can understand what it all means, the more sure and purposeful our steps forward will become, and the more informed our decisions will be. It's just as important for you to hear yourself speak your stories as it is for others to hear you speak them, so that you can come to know you're not alone, and more the same as the person sitting next to you than you are different from them, which you never would have believed unless they opened their mouths to share their stories here in these circles. One thing I want you to understand is that your suffering does not make you special. There's a voice inside everyone who suffers that says, no one else has it like this. No one else has it like me. And so much selfish action comes from listening to that voice. You're not alone. You're not special. And there is help. We have one another. Dr. Hoffman called me out on saying shit was kumbaya in one of our individual counseling sessions. I didn't even know where I got the kumbaya thing, probably a meme. I'd complain that native things can feel corny and fake, or like trying too hard for something that wasn't really there, that the shit was kumbaya. Dr. Hoffman told me the word kumbaya was originally an African American spiritual, a song that was also a prayer asking for divine intervention, asking for help in dire times. And that then the hippies in the 60s took it and sang it to mean unity amid protest. And then it got played out and became a stand-in for corniness about togetherness. Corniness about togetherness, I said back. But there's nothing corny about asking your higher power for help when you need it most, he said. Or do you think that's corny too? Are you asking me for real? Let's just agree that I won't be asking you anything in a not real way in our sessions, okay? Yeah, I think the higher power thing is corny, and the talking circle is corny, and crying out for help when you need it most, if I'm being honest, feels kind of corny too. Like, who's really gonna help when you really need it most? God. Like some great big being who made everything's gonna come around to help some little human life, like one of our little lives matter. Because what about all the good people who die every day crying out for God, and God not doing shit for them? What, they don't deserve it? I appreciate your honesty, Orville. How you feel about these things is real, like you said. and everything can be useful, even corniness. Dr. Hoffman called his approach to trauma and healing using all of the buffalo, which was also super corny. Your feeling that something is corny has to do with trust. You not believing people are being authentic, which probably meant for you that they were lying to you to get their way. In other words, manipulating you. So when you see or hear corniness, you're just responding to a very real and valid feeling you have around trust. He was always looking behind me after asking questions or making statements. There wasn't anything there but a wall, so I guess that was him demonstrating that he was thinking, taking me and my problems seriously. When we start to understand how much of our behavior has to do with trauma response, Dr. Hoffman started saying, but I checked out, looking over his shoulder. Behind him was a window where sometimes a red-headed little bird landed on the sill and looked in on us. Sometimes I thought the bird was imaginary. And when I did, the bird seemed to take on more fantastic qualities, like turning its head to the side, like it was putting its ear to the window. And sometimes I imagined the bird crashing into the window with a thud and dying in the middle of one of our sessions, there below the window pane, dead on the ledge, dead eyes wide open, still looking in on us. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That wasn't corny at all.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to get the nerd craft question out of the way. Do you consider your novels experimental?
I think I came to writing in an unconventional way. Like, I didn't go to school for writing. My undergraduate degree was in sound engineering, which is why I'm like giving extra credit to Christopher and like trying to like have some part in the way things sound.
Sound in here is interesting.
It has nothing to do with me. I learned analog recording from 2002 to 2004, which is almost exactly when the MP3 and digital audio took over the entire industry. So most of my education, which was all analog recording, like was completely pointless as I graduated. So I got a job at a used bookstore because there was not a lot of clear job placement after I went to school. And I fell in love with fiction for the first time. I wasn't a reader before that. And from that point, I read whatever I wanted in a sort of ruthless way. Had nothing to do with like, this is what's good writing, this is the canon, this is the way you should think about the way you would want to write something. I was like in this crazy, isolated place of like, the woman who hired me at the bookstore hired me because she needed to move 2 warehouses into one. Like she was like, this guy can move books. It wasn't because I was a reader, because in the interview, I was like, love The Monster Next Door, the Grover book. You know, like that, I was not a reader at all. Like it was, but I became a reader there and read a lot of weird international books in translation and just read wherever my natural reader instincts led me, because I wasn't doing it for school or like there was no authoritative figure. So in thinking about like, is my novel conventional? Is there conventional? Was I trying to break convention? I was always coming at writing a thing as like, what isn't there? And that usually is something that breaks convention, because what is already there is already there. And the canon produces works that are like the canon. And I've never been about the canon.
Do you remember any of those books that you read haphazardly, as you say, recklessly, going through the catalog? Do any of them stand out to you that you remember?
There are two, and I feel like more so the books themselves, the sort of stakes and the context that I understood the books to exist within had an impact on me. So Confederacy of Dunces and The Bell Jar were both books that struck me, like both books, they may not have lasting power in terms of like, there's some problematic elements to them that people who read them now would be like, not cool. But both authors were masters of language.
Yeah.
And both authors killed themselves.
Yeah.
So for me, what drew me to them was people who had high stakes. It wasn't just like, this is a good philosophical novel that academics like to discuss at college. It was like, these people killed themselves at a pretty early age.
Yeah.
And they had to get this thing out. And it felt to me, you know, I had an intense upbringing as a person in my family. I was drawn to high stakes. So the idea that people were still doing something like writing a novel, which can seem like superfluous or something, wasn't that. There can be an interest in this form, which that was what first drew me to it. And there's a lot of amazing writing in both, and sort of poetic and attention to sentence level detail happening in both that were hugely important, despite, you know, them maybe. Are we done?
That's actually my phone. I'm so sorry, Ian.
This is the first time I've gone through a woman's bag before.
It was probably Kennedy O'Toole calling to say.
His mom, maybe.
His mom. Yeah.
I was 10.
I think I'm going to say that I think that there's something that you found in the novel that was extremely urgent in those novels in particular that is also in your book. In your books, there's also that urgency of language. It moves quickly, and that novels have that potential, right? And so it's just this kind of like urgency to the way that you process a novel and the way that you think about what's happening in a narrative as the time moves through the story. And in both of the novels that you just mentioned, that's absolutely happening, right? That urgency is there. And something that I find experimental about your writing is that you give yourself the job of having a brand new narrator every chapter. Is that more difficult for you or less so?
I think I try to find strategies to keep working.
Yeah.
And I have a distractible mind. And you know, if you're stuck on one piece of the novel, and you feel like you need to focus on that one piece, you can get stuck. and everybody knows about writer's block. Like, this is like a part of the narrative. Like, questions I get from, especially from young people, like, what do you do about writer's block? And figuring out ways to keep working is like a huge part of building a discipline around a practice that a lot of people see not a part of the family of the arts. So like, everyone knows that Rembrandt or Van Gogh, like, they drew and painted a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Writers don't often get it attributed to, like, they were writing a lot to get to the place they got to, mm-hmm. right? I was talking to your students and then to other people yesterday, and so it was like, there's no concert pianist block, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody's ever heard of that. Because, you know, they practice 10 million hours and then do the crazy runs. But I was corrected. Somebody yesterday in line came up and she was like, there are blocks. Concert pianists have blocks. Some kind
like, it's like the twisties.
There's an erectile, there's just some kind of like erectile penile joke in here that I'm not going to land. That has to do with the block and pianist being close enough.
Yes, yes.
It's there somewhere. I don't have it. But what I've found, because I was an athlete and a musician before I was a writer, is how as a writer, because a lot of people don't, there's not a way, unless you go to an MFA program and have that accountability within when you're in the MFA program, mm-hmm. there's not a built-in discipline piece. So you have to find your way in. So mm-hmm. part of what could look like experimentation in There or Wandering Stars with all these different POVs is also part of my revision process. Mm-hmm. So I am constantly switching between POVs mm-hmm. within one single narrative, but also, like, if I'm stuck in one character, I'll move to another mm-hmm. in order to keep working. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to get stuck. And with the internet being so what
Delicious.
It is, it's very easy to go on the internet instead of write.
Yeah.
Or watch something.
Yeah.
And so finding your way into the discipline is part of what created this sort of, the nature of what I ended up writing. Mm-hmm. But it's also the types of books that I like to read. So like Visit from the Goon Squad, A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James. This is Jennifer Egan. Colin McCann's Let the Great World Spin. Louise Erdrich, Love Medicine. These are fragmented narratives where the reader's enjoyment and process is in figuring out how they're connected. Yeah. And I like that novels can push the reader toward making a connection mm-hmm. rather than like the single narrative hero arc, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But what I like to read is what I like to write. And that's part of where that comes from too. Yeah.
And I think too, there was this thing that you were saying earlier about how young writers feel this fear of the block. And I think that also comes from an experience. But when you start any project, any first draft is terrible. It's like you're starting over, like you're learning the violin and so in this case, you have several different voices that you're honing, and the consistency between the chapters where they come back is part of the joy of reading your books, is getting to hear Opal again, recognizing Orville, and considering that it's all coming from the same pen and from the same concept is I think, an experimental thing. But it could be the tension between literature professor and writer, right? Because in my world, you're putting everything into these boxes to make into some kind of sequence that you can put into a lecture, right? But when you talk to me about the process, it really does sound like the form is a development of who you are as a writer, how you write, both in terms of your physical practice, but also your formal choices. Yeah.
I often feel in this role as like a writer having to be his book person.
Yeah.
So I once took lessons from this like crazy jazz pianist, like master who lived in a shack in northern New Mexico. And it was at the time I was trying to take music more seriously, and I was playing a lot. And I played for him something I was working on, and he asked me about my background, and he called me basically an idiot savant. It's like a compliment and
Yes.
a dig at the same time.
It's like you're accidentally good at this.
And that's the way I feel about being a writer. I feel like to some extent, I know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I feel there's a magic trick to art where you spend a lot of time at one thing. I worked 6 years at one thing. And to ask me any particular part is to ask me to decompress a long period of time where I was doing a lot of different things. And I'm never going to be as smart as I was over a 6-year span that I can be within, a 60-minute conversation or less. And it can feel like a fraud to try to be as smart as your book. Because you'll never be as smart as your book.
No.
I hope so. Because you spend so much time on so many sentences, and there's so much consideration around that thing.
Yeah.
And the goal of the writer is like, I'm going to do this thing over here, and nobody's going to be here. And the people experiencing it, there's nobody going to be there, and they're going to be experiencing it.
Yeah.
And so sort of the nightmare blessing situation is like, now you get to be the thing in front of everybody. And it's the most annoying thing for a writer to complain about success when like the landscape of literature is like horrific right now. Like I don't mean to say that.
Yeah.
But it can be really hard to try to say too much about like I designed everything perfectly and I knew everything that I was doing. Because I give myself over to the process over a long period of time, and I trust the process, and I trust that it's not all me doing it.
That's inspiring, right? Maybe. Yeah. The students in our seminar before you came talked a lot about a concept that's pretty buzzy right now for them, which is epigenetics, and the idea of intergenerational trauma, and that the crisis of intergenerational trauma is that you don't always know what it is exactly that you're suffering from that happened multiple generations before you, but that you don't know is happening. And their conversations led us to a place in which we were talking about all of the things that get passed from generation to generation, language, culture, etc. Trauma is one of them. And I was wondering about the choice to keep this narrative generational all the way up until the end, in which we have 2 generations or 3 generations sitting at the table in the diner. And I wondered if you saw your novel, well, maybe let's just open it up to a different kind of conversation to say, do you think that there is room in the novel for these kinds of redemptive arcs where the next generation is the cycle breaker and they move forward? Or is it more that every generation repeats a new trauma or has a new trauma? I think that the text for this, of course, is Beloved by Toni Morrison, who you cite in the book, so I think I'm allowed to bring her up in this situation. But the character of Denver, as you all know, is often talked about as the cycle breaker, as the one who leaves the house. And so I'm going to pick up on something that a student shared with me, which is that she sees a future for Luther and Vi and their baby. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit.
Sure.
Or is it a secret?
No. I thought calling myself an idiot savant was going to end the whole conversation, and we were going to be able to. I'm just kidding. So the third part of the sequence of There, There, and Wandering Stars recently started sort of happening from the perspective of Luther.
Yeah.
And there was like this certain time expanse of like people headed to a powwow and a little bit of a flashback to the 70s for the occupation of Alcatraz. And Wandering Stars was this 160-year generational saga. So the next book is from Luther's perspective, partially a big shout out to middle children because he was the middle child and he was totally like left out in the book. Like Lonnie and Orville got a lot more love. So if anybody's read Wandering Stars and felt like I did some Luther middle child ignoring stuff that hurt you, I'm sorry. But the next book is like a single day in Oakland and sort of still check in with the family. But it's sort of crazy stuff that happens in a single day. But that book is, I don't even know officially where it's at. I'm working on a different book that's not related to my first two books that I sold last November that I'm hoping to finish by the end of the year. That's totally unrelated, and that's not what you asked me about.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Or not yet?
It's a book about pretendians. I said this to people during this trip. When I said it, I got a lot of confused looks.
Yeah.
But as soon as I said pretend Indians, everyone's like, oh, okay, I know what that is.
Yeah.
So it's a phenomenon in the States and in Canada that's like crazy. One of the most famous Native American people of all time, Buffy St. Marie, was recently outed. She's like 80 years old as not being Native. And she's like built this whole career, has tons of awards. Does anybody know about this? Does this sound crazy? A couple people. If you could imagine, like, let's just say, like, a Dutch person rises to fame and glory, and in the hearts of Dutch people, songs that have meant stuff for generations. You find out they're not Dutch. They
Yeah.
were just pretending to be.
Yeah.
That's a crazy emotional thing to happen to a whole people. So
Yeah.
that's not what the book's about. I'm writing a book that's sort of the idea of the pretendian is a theme in the book. And I'm not going to go into it. It's going to be rambling or boring for me to describe.
Well, we have to read it, and then you'll come back. So that'll work. I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up, so get ready. I wanted to, okay, so mothering women, not all of them mothers, but mothering women are a big part of this book. And it starts out patrilineal and then switches to matrilineal halfway through. And as a single mother of a teenager, we've talked a lot about this together, I found these characters to be deeply inspiring because they're fully formed characters. They're not just caregivers, right? And I was just wondering, what is the role of these kinds of women in your community, in your world? Do you feel that these characters are based on someone, or are you looking for these people in your world?
So before writing There, I did a lot of storytelling, community storytelling work, which was basically like helping people tell their own stories and then turning them into short films. And there were elders and different generations of Native people who'd never been asked to tell their stories. And I came to understand that their specific details from their lives, like this person came from South Dakota and like worked on a used car lot, and like, this is not real, and like, came out to his parents and then moved to San Francisco. This is not something I would ever use as a real character, because I worked with them intimately on pulling out their stories and getting them to a place of vulnerability to tell their stories, and then help transform those stories into short films, and collaborating with them the whole way. So I never used anybody's story in any of the fiction. At the same time, like, I needed the stories to feel true to like what could exist based on my experience in the community. And the absent father and the strong feminine or mother presence is just a reality. Like, I don't know how it is out here in the Netherlands. I think I see a lot of like strong-looking dads, but there's a problem with men in America that runs very deep and is very toxic.
Yeah.
And it's not specific to Native people, but it's real. And so that just ended up in the narrative to me personally. So it ended up there because I saw it in the community. It's real to me.
Yeah.
And women, Native women show up in ways that Native men don't. Are Dutch men holding it down? Is that true? That's great. Is that true? Raise of hand. Can we get a little count?
I'd love it if anyone has any questions. I'll bring you the mic. Yes, please. Hold on just one second.
Thank you. Do I say my name or anything like that? Oh. Pamela Armstrong. I'm an expat currently living here in the Netherlands, and I have a question about your writing. Apologize, I haven't read your books, but I just bought one, so I'll be reading it, and maybe you've covered this. I want to ask you about the unsolved murders of females on the reservation, and if you're planning on writing that or if you've covered that. And I also want to talk about labels and identity as defined by the American culture. You talked about pretend Indians, but I had a conversation with Wes Studi not too long ago, well, actually about 20 years ago when I was living in the States. And I asked him about people who have mixed heritage that includes Indian ancestors and or a card-carrying Indian parent. And I asked him if they could call themselves Indian, even though they were not full-blooded. His answer to me, or his question to me was, You have to make a choice to be Indian or not. My question to you is it that simple?
So the feature film that I'm working on is Wes Studi's supposed to be the actor starring in it, and it came from an article I wrote for GQ that was sort of like a profile of him. It's a very complicated thing in some ways. The pretending thing, who's real, who's not. There's blood quantum. What he was probably speaking to, if it was 20 years ago, it was probably a simpler time. Even the use of the word Indian is controversial. I grew up hearing my dad use it, and he grew up seeing on signs outside of bars, no Indians or dogs allowed. So there are parallels with the N-word in the ways that it's reclaimed. It's not the same as the N-word. It has never been to that level. But there are parallels, just as there are parallels between Native lives and Black lives, and the ways that the U.S. government has caused systematic damage on massive levels, and continues, in different ways, has a narrative that continues to cause damage to communities. The first part of your question, do you remember what the first part of the question was?
Murders
Oh, right.
of Indigenous women
So in
the redress movement.
There's a character in a chapter. That character's named Blue. I'm not sure which book you bought, but in the first book, in there, it's sort of directly talking about the situation that Native women find themselves in, and it's a novel, so I'm telling a story in the chapter. I'm not like addressing what to do. But I am recently in conversation with the Secretary Treasurer of the United States, Deb Haaland, who's the first Native woman or Native person to ever be in that kind of position. She showed up to my book event in DC when Wandering Stars came out. And she's doing a lot of really important work around it, and she text messaged me 2 days ago and said, "I love Wandering Stars." And that was an amazing text message to get. So, as a novelist, I can't pretend to be on the forefront of addressing that issue. But in there, I did, I worked in the nonprofit community and the Native community in Oakland, and was working with people and under grants to address these things, and very much knew about them for years. And in the novel, I tried to address it in a chapter. But I can't pretend that literature is, even the activists working toward trying to figure out this missing and murdered Indigenous women situation is very bleak. So I know about it. I've done what I can do. I'm connected to people who are trying on a high level system, trying to do things. But it's a very bleak situation. Bleak?
What do you mean by bleak?
Like there's no system level work that even somebody like Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary Treasurer, can do about the change of the situation. You can draw people's attention to it, but it's not changing. Just as a lot of Native issues, as much as attention you can draw to them, Americans don't actually care. It's bleak. It's not just that issue.
Do you see a way forward? Can you describe a futurity out of that?
I feel like we just went down a
Okay.
sad path. Do we want to send people home with sadness? If we want to
No.
be real,
Yes. Sorry, one moment, please. Thank you.
Let me get my breath. Tommy, when you have touched on issues in our culture, like somehow you've gotten to the heart of our issues. And I'm talking about the First Nations people, the Indians, the Pretendians, the fentanyl crisis, the drug crisis. When I was reading this book, my partner said, "Is it good?" I said, "No. No." And I didn't know how to explain that. Why does this book have to be written? Why does it have to be written? Because it's telling the truth. And I thought about it a lot, and I've been thinking about it. I took my time slowly to read the book. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? You know what he did? Or God? You know what he did? He took the pain and he wrapped it in beauty. And he took the beauty and he wrapped it in pain. And I don't know where that came from, but it came from somewhere. And you are an activist. Maybe not for the missing and murdered women and girls. Maybe not for the fentanyl crisis and the drug crisis. But you've planted yourself in the middle of our biggest issues today. And I just want to say thank you. I'm so grateful.
Thank you. I'm also so grateful that you're here. Thank you for your book. And I have a question. I hope it makes sense. So what does it mean to be Native? Which, for me, is really a big question. I'm mixed Cherokee and Cayuga from Ontario, Canada. My mother is Black First Nations and my father is white. And sometimes I think I'm actually a pretendian because I actually don't know how to be Native or what that means. And I feel like in your book, you really express that. And I'm going to just stick to my book. And that made me realize that, I'm actually not the only one who's not sure how to be who they are. Growing up, my mom would do with my family, we'd do all these things. We'd go to powwow. My mom would sweetgrass the house. My grandmother and my grandfather would use all these medicines, but with like no explanation. And for a long time, even up until recently, I was really angry, like, well, why didn't you teach me anything? And now I've lost my grandparents and I've lost my mom. And I realize now, like, actually that was unsafe. They weren't allowed. They haven't yet. I hear my voice shaking. And, we would go down to this place called Spirit Road, which was when I was a kid, it was just like a really dark country road. And my grandparents would get out of the car and we'd all go look at the stars. And I was always like, why are we doing this? Like, what's going on? And I never got any explanation. And that's just partly why I wanted to thank you for this book, because I realized there's so many of us who are now in our 40s and 50s where we're trying to put a whole life together and make sense of our past and where we came from without any reference. So I feel like I did get some kind of community from your book. Also reading it all the way out here in Amsterdam. And there's one part of your book which I really loved, and I'm terrible with names of characters. And it's this moment when the older woman is on a date as she meets this man who loves pie, and they're talking about how he's black, but she can see that he's not just black, and that there's something else in his, and she's looking at him trying to figure out what is it that she sees. And there's this crucial difference in looking from a person of color, especially a native black person, looking at you, trying to understand where you come from, because it's coming from a place of connection and really longing to feel a connectivity. And I think you express this in the book as opposed to a moment of trying to understand how they should treat you. So thank you for that. And lastly, I think it was Tracy K. Smith who says that she is her first audience. And I was wondering if when you're writing, whether or not you think about that, but so when you're your first audience, you're looking in the mirror and discovering things about your own self. And I was wondering if you could share with us if that's true for you and what perhaps has come to surface. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that before. Very powerful words and things to share with me about yourselves, and very complimentary and generous things to say about me and my work. When I was writing There, for the first 3 years of writing it, I read to my wife on the back porch of our apartment only, and no one else knew I was doing it. And then I got into an MFA, and the idea of who would eventually be reading it was just my classmates and my teachers. And then the director of the school was if you publish a book, you can get a teaching job here. And that became the highest thing that could happen. I never thought of a book becoming whatever my books have become. It was never something that I was thinking would happen. So I thought I would get a small university press to publish it so I could get a teaching job. And then I'd make my students read it. And my fellow professors would pretend to have read it.
That's exactly how it works.
That's how it goes, right? I could tell even as a student. And even writing certain things, knowing that I was writing to a native audience, was never wanting to preach to the choir or, say things that I knew people already knew. I always wanted to try to find a way to write in a compelling enough way that even if you knew the information, it was being delivered on a language level in a way that you would still want to read it. So always with it in mind that if native readers were the only ones reading it, because that's sort of where the book grew from, I would be writing it in a way that had an emotional intelligence that would still speak to them. With the second book, it became a lot trickier because it was already a New York Times bestseller, and my publisher told me they're printing 100,000 copies before anybody asked me if they wanted to read it, or like, it would just be out there. And it was a crazy thing because the general reader wants to see you, whether you fall on your face or succeed. And so that was a whole different like reader experience. But what I always write toward as a writer is readability, and on a sentence level, like, is there some kind of propulsion that makes the reader want to keep on reading? And there are things that I want to say that are going to come through whether I, on a day-to-day basis, whether I'm like trying to put in my ideas and what I care about, that stuff's going to happen anyway. My revision brain and what I bring to try to make it the best book it can be is always toward readability and not toward audience or a specific reader. It's always toward like, what is the reading experience of this?
Thank you so much. I don't think we have any time for any more questions. Can I ask a favor? Would you mind reading the last paragraph of the book?
The end.
Yeah. It has no spoilers, it's just hope.
This.
Yes.
I hope I didn't stay away too long. It won't ever be the same as it was before. We all know that. I hope you all haven't forgotten about us, about how we used to be when we were good. Of course, you can't forget the bad shit even if you try. Even if you do it, it still comes at you. It can take superhuman strength to remember what was good. Don't be dumb, I guess I have to say. Like, don't make it worse that I came back, okay? I hope you're there. Most of all, I just hope you're all there.
Thank you, Jesse, and especially thank you, Tommy, for joining us here this evening. And it is wonderful to see how your work has touched so many people so deeply. So many of these reactions were not really questions, but remarks about how you made people feel with your work. And I think that in itself is a wonderful compliment. I want to give you a heads up on some of the, on a completely different note, I must say. A heads up on some of the things that are coming up at the John Adams, which will all be very different from this evening. We, of course, have an election night coming up, together with the BKB Campagnebureau and the Netherlands Atlantic Association on November 5th, at this momentous moment. We are coming together to witness what we can of the elections, given the time difference. We have the entire Tolhuistuin just across the water on the north side of Amsterdam. We have room for about 1,200 people. Tickets are going fast, so I would say don't wait and make sure you join us there. Nieuwsuur will be broadcasting live from the venue. Barlaat will be broadcasting live from the venue. We have panels, we have mini talks, we have people calling in from the States. It's going to be, of course, we don't know yet what the outcome will be. And we won't know when we go to bed at some point late that night. But I'm sure no matter what the outcome is, the evening itself is going to be fantastic. Famous last words moving around the deck chairs of the Titanic, right? In that same vein, oh yes, and we have a special election podcast series. 3 podcasts hosted by Lila Frank, speaking with consequential Americans. The first is Carol Anderson, who is a professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and I can tell you this woman is on fire. Coming up this Wednesday, is that right, Ian? This Wednesday we have Mark Leibovich, who has spoken at the John Adams and journalist at The Atlantic. And then 2 weeks later we'll have Kim Wheely, who is an expert on the Constitution in our election podcast. In between those events, we have on October 15th, Cynthia Idris Miller, who has written a book with the pretentious title, Hate in the Homeland. I'm afraid she's not said too much. She's an expert in radicalization, polarization, things that we see happening all around us now in the US. And she will be joined on stage by the sociologist from Yale, Philip Gorski, who specializes in white Christian nationalism. So I don't know how you'll feel after that evening. So then after that, soon come to the election evening on the 5th and at least have some fun there. 2 words I wanted to mention about things that are coming up next year that we know already. On the 9th of February, we're collaborating with the Rijksmuseum, who has been working for 6 years on an exhibition of American photography. And we'll be doing an event on Sunday, February 9th in the Rijksmuseum itself. And then on April 3rd, our best-loved John Adams author and speaker and former director, Russell Shorto, will be joining us again at the John Adams to talk about his new book. You don't have to remember all these dates if you get our newsletter. So if you don't get our newsletter, make sure you do. And while you're thinking about it, maybe you'll decide to become a member or join our friends or our family. We need you. There was one quote that really stuck, there were several this evening that really stuck with me, and I think to address the greater portent of this evening, there was one quote I'd like to leave you with. We need moments where the past is present and where there's room for the future. And I think that applies also beautifully to the situation our country is in at the moment, and I think we were all longing for that opening, that moment where there's room for the future. So stay with us and put on your seatbelts. It's going to be a wild ride. Thank you. Thank you, Tommy.